The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked linoleum floor of Mel's diner as Sarah Martinez tied her apron strings for what felt like the thousandth time. At 28, she had been working at this small-town restaurant for nearly 6 years, serving coffee and comfort food to truck drivers, factory workers, and the occasional traveler passing through Cedar Falls, Iowa. The pay was modest, the hours long, but Sarah found meaning in the simple act of caring for others, even if it was just refilling their coffee cups and remembering how they liked their eggs. It was a Tuesday morning in October when she first noticed him. Walter Kowalski sat alone in the corner booth, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee that had long since grown cold. He was tall and thin, with silver hair neatly combed and eyes the color of storm clouds. What struck Sarah most was not his appearance, but his posture, ramrod straight, shoulders back, even while seated. There was something unmistakably military about the way he carried himself. Sarah approached his table with the practiced smile she reserved for new customers. "Good morning, sir. Can I get you something to eat?" she asked, notepad ready. Walter looked up at her with those piercing gray eyes, and for a moment she saw something flicker there, surprise, perhaps, that someone was actually speaking to him. "Just the coffee, miss," he replied, his voice gravelly but polite. "Thank you kindly." There was a formality to his speech that seemed from another era, and Sarah noticed the slight tremor in his hands as he reached for the cup. "Are you sure? We make a mean breakfast here. My grandmother's recipe for biscuits and gravy," Sarah offered, sensing somehow that this man needed more than just caffeine. Walter studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether her kindness was genuine. "Well," he said slowly, "I suppose I could try those biscuits." As Sarah walked back to place his order, she glanced over her shoulder to see Walter staring out the window at the American flag that hung from the pole in front of the hardware store across the street. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his gaze that spoke of memories and distances far beyond the quiet streets of Cedar Falls. When she returned with his breakfast, Walter was studying a faded photograph he had pulled from his wallet. Sarah caught a glimpse of 4 young men in military uniforms, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera with the carefree confidence of youth. "That's a nice picture," Sarah said gently as she set down his plate. "Military." Walter's hand closed over the photograph protectively. "Vietnam," he said simply. "Long time ago." He slipped the photo back into his wallet and picked up his fork, but Sarah noticed he didn't immediately begin eating. "Thank you for your service," Sarah said, meaning it. She had grown up hearing stories from her grandfather who had served in World War II, and she understood the weight that veterans sometimes carried. Walter looked up at her again, this time with unmistakable surprise. "Not many folks say that about Vietnam," he said quietly. "Well, they should," Sarah replied firmly. "You served your country, that matters." Something shifted in Walter's expression then, a tiny crack in the armor he wore. He took a bite of the biscuits and gravy, and his eyes widened slightly. "These are excellent," he said. "Your grandmother taught you well." Sarah beamed. She always said food tastes better when it's made with love. From that day forward, Walter Kowalski became a regular at Mel's diner. Every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday morning, he would arrive at exactly 8:30 and take the same corner booth. He always ordered the same thing, black coffee and biscuits and gravy, and he always left exact change with a modest tip. But more importantly, he began to talk. At first, the conversations were brief and formal. Walter would comment on the weather or thank Sarah for the meal. But gradually, as weeks turned into months, he began to share fragments of his story. Sarah learned that he was 94 years old and lived alone in a small apartment on the other side of town. His wife, Margaret, had passed away 8 years earlier after 52 years of marriage. They had never had children, and most of his friends were gone now too. "Don't mean to sound like I'm complaining," Walter would always add after sharing something personal. "Just the way life goes." But Sarah could see the loneliness in his eyes, the way he lingered over his coffee as if reluctant to return to his empty apartment. Sarah found herself looking forward to Walter's visits. She would save the corner booth for him and make sure the coffee was fresh when he arrived. She began learning about his life before the war, how he had grown up on a farm in Nebraska, how he had met Margaret at a USO dance, how they had built a quiet life together after he returned from Vietnam. Walter spoke of Margaret with a tenderness that made Sarah's heart ache. "She was the prettiest girl at that dance," Walter told her one morning, his eyes distant with memory. But she picked me out of all those boys in uniform, never could figure out why. He shook his head with wonder as if their love story had happened to someone else. As autumn gave way to winter, Sarah noticed changes in Walter. Some days he seemed confused about small things, forgetting which booth was his, or asking for sugar in his coffee when he had always taken it black. Other days he appeared more frail, moving more slowly as he made his way to his table. Sarah began to worry about him, wondering if he was eating enough, if he was taking care of himself. One particularly cold morning in December, Walter didn't show up for his usual Tuesday visit. Sarah found herself glancing at the door every few minutes, anxiety gnawing at her stomach. When he missed Thursday as well, she made a decision that would change everything. She looked up his address in the phone book and drove to his apartment after her shift ended. The building was old and worn, with narrow hallways that smelled of disinfectant and loneliness. Walter answered his door in his pajamas and a bathrobe, looking smaller and more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. His apartment was neat but sparse, with military decorations displayed proudly on one wall and photographs of Margaret scattered throughout. "Sarah," Walter's voice was filled with confusion and embarrassment. "What are you doing here?" "You missed your breakfast," she said simply. "I was worried about you." Walter's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment the proud veteran facade crumbled completely. "I've been feeling a bit under the weather," he admitted. "Didn't want to burden anyone." "You're not a burden," Sarah said firmly. "You're my friend." From that night forward, Sarah began checking on Walter regularly. She would stop by his apartment after work, bringing him soup when he was sick, groceries when his cabinet was bare, and most importantly, companionship when the silence became too heavy to bear. She helped him organize his medications and convinced him to let her drive him to doctor's appointments. Walter protested at first, insisting he didn't need charity, but Sarah made it clear that this wasn't charity, it was friendship. The other waitresses at Mel's diner thought Sarah was crazy for taking on the responsibility of caring for an elderly stranger. "You've got your own life to worry about," her coworker Linda would say. "What are you getting out of this?" But Sarah couldn't explain the deep satisfaction she found in Walter's grateful smile, or the way his stories transported her to different times and places. Through Walter's memories, she learned about courage and sacrifice, about love that endured through decades of ordinary days and extraordinary challenges. Walter had given her something precious, a connection to history, to heroism, and to the kind of love that most people only read about in books. As winter melted into spring, their friendship deepened. Walter began to share more difficult memories, the friends he had lost in Vietnam, the nightmares that still sometimes woke him in the middle of the night, the guilt he carried for surviving when so many others didn't. Sarah listened without judgment, holding space for his pain in the same way she had always held space for his stories of joy. "You remind me of Margaret," Walter told her one afternoon as they sat in his small living room looking through photo albums. "She had the same kind heart you do, always taking care of everyone else before herself." Sarah felt honored by the comparison, knowing how deeply Walter had loved his wife. She was beginning to understand that their friendship was healing something in both of them, Walter's loneliness and her own sense of purpose. In caring for this forgotten veteran, she had found her calling. But neither of them could have predicted what was about to happen on an ordinary Tuesday morning in May, when 4 United States Marines would walk into Mel's diner and change everything forever. The arrival of these young men in their crisp uniforms would unlock a mystery from Walter's past and reveal a truth that had been hidden for more than 50 years. A truth that would transform not only how Sarah saw her elderly friend, but how the entire community of Cedar Falls understood the meaning of heroism and sacrifice. The morning of May 15th started like any other Tuesday at Mel's diner. Sarah arrived early to prep the coffee machines and set up the dining room, humming softly to herself as she arranged the salt and pepper shakers on each table. The spring air carried the scent of blooming lilacs through the open windows, and she felt unusually optimistic about the day ahead. Walter would arrive in an hour for his regular breakfast, and she had saved him an extra large portion of the strawberry preserves he had recently grown fond of. At exactly 8:30, Walter shuffled through the door, moving more slowly than usual. Sarah noticed immediately that he seemed agitated, his normally neat appearance slightly disheveled. His hands shook more than normal as he made his way to his corner booth, and when she approached with the coffee pot, She could see perspiration on his forehead despite the cool morning temperature. "Good morning, Walter," Sarah said gently, pouring his coffee with practiced ease. "How are you feeling today?" Walter looked up at her with eyes that seemed troubled and distant. "Been having strange dreams," he said quietly. "Dreams about the war, about my unit." He paused, wrapping his hands around the warm coffee cup as if seeking comfort from its heat. "Haven't had dreams like that in years, Sarah, not since Margaret was alive." Sarah felt a familiar pang of concern. Over the months, she had learned to read the subtle signs of Walter's difficult days. The way he held his shoulders when memories pressed too heavily, the distant look that crept into his eyes when the past seemed more real than the present. She pulled a chair from the adjacent table and sat down across from him, something she had never done during the breakfast rush. "Do you want to talk about the dreams?" she asked softly. Walter was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if it held answers. "We were in the jungle," he began slowly. "My unit, Alpha Company, 3rd Battalion. There were 4 of us who always stuck together. Best friends, you know. Tommy Rodriguez from Texas, Mike O'Brien from Boston, and Danny Chen from California. We called ourselves the 4 Horsemen because we always rode into trouble together." Sarah had heard fragments of these names before in Walter's stories, but never with such vivid detail. She remained silent, sensing that something important was emerging from the depths of his memory. "In the dream, we were back in that place," Walter continued, his voice growing stronger as the story took hold. "March 23rd, 1969, we were on patrol near the Cambodian border when we walked into an ambush. Charlie had been waiting for us, hidden in the trees like ghosts." His hands began to tremble more noticeably. "Tommy got hit first, then Mike. Danny was trying to drag them to cover when the mortars started falling." Walter's breathing became labored, and Sarah reached across to touch his arm gently. "Walter, you don't have to." "No," he said firmly, meeting her eyes. "I need to tell someone. I've been carrying this for 56 years, and Margaret was the only one who knew the whole truth. But she's gone now, and these dreams, they feel like a message." Sarah settled back in her chair, giving Walter the space he needed to continue. "I should have died that day," Walter said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We all should have, but something happened that I never understood, not until years later. We were pinned down, taking heavy fire, when suddenly the enemy position exploded. Someone had called in an artillery strike, danger close to our position. Saved our lives, but it was impossible. We didn't have radio contact with base. Our equipment was shot to hell." Walter reached into his wallet and pulled out the faded photograph Sarah had seen many times before, 4 young men in uniform, arms around each other's shoulders. But this time, he held it differently, with a reverence she had never noticed. "2 weeks after that firefight, Danny pulled me aside and told me something that changed everything. He had seen someone that day, someone who shouldn't have been there. A Marine unit had been operating in our sector without our knowledge, conducting a classified mission. One of their radio operators had overheard our distress calls and convinced his commanding officer to provide fire support, even though it meant revealing their position to the enemy." Sarah felt goosebumps rise on her arms as she began to understand the significance of Walter's story. "We never found out who those Marines were," Walter continued. "Military intelligence classified the whole operation, but Danny swore he saw one of them watching us from the tree line after the artillery strike. A young Marine, couldn't have been more than 19 or 20, just standing there making sure we were okay before his unit disappeared back into the jungle." Walter paused to sip his coffee, and Sarah noticed that his hands had steadied as he spoke. The act of sharing seemed to be bringing him peace. "For years after the war, I tried to find information about that Marine unit. I wrote letters to the Pentagon, contacted veteran organizations, even hired a private investigator with my savings from the factory job. But everything was classified, sealed away in files that I would never be allowed to see. I gave up eventually, but I never forgot. How could I? Those Marines saved 4 lives that day, and they never got any recognition for it." "What made you think about it now?" Sarah asked gently. "Dreams have been so vivid," Walter said. "But last night was different. In the dream, I was old like I am now, and I was sitting right here in this booth. That young Marine walked through the door, but he wasn't 19 anymore. He was older, maybe in his 70s, wearing dress blues. He walked right up to me and said, 'Sergeant Kowalski, my name is Colonel James Harrison, retired. On March 23rd, 1969, my unit provided fire support for Alpha Company, 3rd Battalion. I want you to know that we never forgot what you and your men did after we saved your lives.'" Sarah felt confused. What you did after they saved your lives, what does that mean? Walter's eyes filled with tears. That's the part of the story I never told anyone except Margaret. After the artillery strike, we found the enemy position completely destroyed. But there were wounded enemy soldiers in the rubble, and some of them were just kids, Sarah. Couldn't have been older than 15 or 16. Tommy and Mike and Danny and I, we spent the rest of that day giving first aid to those wounded soldiers, sharing our water and medical supplies with them. Walter's voice broke as he continued. We radioed for medical evacuation for everyone, our wounded and theirs. It was the right thing to do, but it was also dangerous. We could have been court-martialed for giving aid to the enemy. But we couldn't just leave those boys to die. They were somebody's sons, just like we were somebody's sons. Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. The moral complexity of war was something she had never fully grasped until this moment, seeing it through Walter's eyes. In my dream, the Marine colonel told me that his unit had been watching us through binoculars during that whole rescue operation. They saw us treating the enemy wounded, and it made such an impression on him that he spent his entire military career trying to find out who we were. He said we showed him what honor really meant that day. Walter folded the photograph carefully and returned it to his wallet. When I woke up this morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that the dream meant something, like Margaret was trying to tell me something from wherever she is now. Sarah was about to respond when the bell above the diner's front door chimed. She looked up and felt her breath catch in her throat. 4 men in United States Marine dress blue uniforms had entered the restaurant, their bearing unmistakably military despite the age visible in their faces. The youngest appeared to be in his 70s, while the oldest looked to be near Walter's age. They stood in the doorway for a moment, scanning the dining room as if looking for someone specific. Walter, Sarah whispered, her voice urgent. Look. Walter turned in his seat, and the color drained from his face. The lead Marine, a tall man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, was staring directly at him with an expression of recognition and something deeper, respect perhaps, or even reverence. The Marine began walking toward their table, his 3 companions following behind in formation. As they approached, Sarah could see that the lead Marine's uniform displayed the insignia of a full colonel, and his chest was decorated with numerous ribbons and medals that spoke of a distinguished career. When they reached the table, all 4 Marines came to attention and rendered a perfect military salute. The entire diner fell silent, the usual morning chatter dying away as every customer and employee turned to watch this unprecedented scene. Sergeant Walter Kowalski, the colonel said in a strong, clear voice that carried across the silent restaurant. My name is Colonel James Harrison, United States Marine Corps, retired. On March 23, 1969, your unit was engaged with enemy forces near the Cambodian border. My unit provided fire support that day. Walter's hands began to shake violently, and he gripped the edge of the table as if he might fall. Sarah could see tears forming in his eyes as he stared up at the Marines who still held their salute. Colonel, Walter managed to whisper, How did you find me? We never stopped looking, Sergeant, Colonel Harrison replied, his own voice thick with emotion. What you and your men did that day, treating the enemy wounded, sharing your supplies, calling for medical evacuation for soldiers who had been trying to kill you just hours before, it changed all of us. We've been searching for you for over 50 years, waiting for the military to declassify enough information for us to track you down. The colonel reached into his jacket and pulled out an official-looking document. By order of the Commandant of the Marine Corps, and with the approval of the Secretary of Defense, we are here to present you with the Humanitarian Service Medal, awarded for your actions on March 23, 1969, in providing life-saving medical aid to wounded enemy personnel under combat conditions. Walter struggled to stand, his legs unsteady with shock and emotion. Sarah quickly moved to support him, her own eyes now streaming with tears as she witnessed this extraordinary moment of recognition that had been 56 years in the making. But Colonel Harrison wasn't finished. He nodded to one of the other Marines, who stepped forward carrying a wooden box. We also bear a message from the government of Vietnam, the colonel continued. 3 of the enemy soldiers you saved that day survived their wounds and went on to live full lives. One became a teacher, one became a doctor, and one became a government official who has spent decades promoting reconciliation between our nations. They never forgot the American soldiers who showed them mercy when they could have shown none. The diner was completely silent now, with several customers openly weeping as they witnessed this scene of honor and recognition. Sarah felt as if she was watching history unfold, understanding finally that her elderly friend was not just a forgotten veteran, but a hero whose actions had echoed through decades and across continents. Colonel Harrison opened the wooden box to reveal a medal unlike any Sarah had ever seen, its ribbon bearing the colors of both the American and Vietnamese flags. "This is the Medal of Reconciliation," he said. "It has only been awarded 12 times in history to individuals whose actions transcended the boundaries of conflict and demonstrated the highest ideals of humanity." As the colonel prepared to place the medal around Walter's neck, he paused and looked around the diner at all the silent, tearful faces watching this ceremony. "Sergeant Kowalski," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "you have spent more than half a century thinking that your service was forgotten, that your sacrifice didn't matter. I am here to tell you that you are wrong. You and your 3 brothers in arms showed the world that even in the darkest moments of war, the light of human compassion can still shine through. You saved lives that day, not just the enemy wounded, but the souls of every Marine who witnessed your actions." Walter was openly sobbing now, his proud military bearing finally giving way to the overwhelming emotion of this moment. Sarah held his arm tightly, her heart breaking and soaring simultaneously as she watched her dear friend finally receive the recognition he had deserved for more than 5 decades. The ceremony was far from over, and the revelations that were about to unfold would transform not only Walter's understanding of his own story, but Sarah's comprehension of the intricate ways that individual acts of kindness can ripple through time and space, creating connections that transcend nationality, politics, and even death itself. As Colonel Harrison placed the Medal of Reconciliation around Walter's neck, the entire diner erupted in spontaneous applause. Truck drivers, factory workers, and early morning coffee drinkers all stood to honor this elderly veteran who had lived among them unrecognized for decades. Sarah watched through her tears as Walter's weathered face transformed with an expression she had never seen before, not just joy, but a profound sense of peace that seemed to settle into his very bones. The colonel waited for the applause to die down before continuing. "Sergeant Kowalski, there's more to this story that you need to know. The 3 men standing with me today are not just fellow Marines. They are the sons of the soldiers whose lives you helped save that day in 1969. Walter's eyes widened in shock as the 3 other Marines stepped forward. The youngest, who appeared to be in his early 50s, spoke first. "My name is Captain Michael Rodriguez, United States Marine Corps, retired," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "My father was Sergeant Tommy Rodriguez, who served with you in Alpha Company. He died in 2018, but before he passed, he told me about the American soldiers who risked their own lives to save wounded enemy combatants. He said it was the most important lesson he ever learned about what it means to be human." The second Marine, a man with graying temples and kind eyes, stepped forward. "I'm Major Patrick O'Brien, also retired. My father, Mike O'Brien, never stopped talking about that day and what you taught him about mercy and courage. He became a paramedic after the war because of what he experienced treating those wounded soldiers with you." The third Marine, an Asian American man with the bearing of a career officer, spoke last. "I am Colonel Daniel Chen, son of Staff Sergeant Danny Chen. My father passed away just last year, but with his dying breath, he made me promise to find you and tell you that you were the best man he ever knew. He said you showed him that honor isn't just about fighting for your country. It's about remembering that your enemies are human beings too." Walter sank back into his seat, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being revealed to him. Sarah pulled up another chair, positioning herself close enough to offer support while giving the Marines space to continue their extraordinary presentation. Colonel Harrison opened his briefcase and removed a thick folder. "Over the past 5 decades, the 4 families, yours, Rodriguez, O'Brien, and Chen, have all been searching for information about that day. The military's classification system made it nearly impossible, but recent changes in policy allowed us to piece together the full story." He opened the folder and spread several documents across the table. "What we discovered is that the artillery strike my unit called in that day was just the beginning of a chain of events that changed countless lives across 3 countries. Sarah leaned in to look at the documents, seeing official military reports, medical records, and even handwritten letters in various languages. The scope of the paperwork suggested a story far more complex than she had imagined. The enemy soldiers you treated that day were part of a North Vietnamese unit that included several very young recruits, Colonel Harrison continued. One of them was a 16-year-old boy named Nguyen Van Duc. He was critically wounded and would have died without the medical attention you provided. Duc grew up to become Dr. Nguyen Van Duc, one of Vietnam's leading heart surgeons. Over his career, he has saved more than 3,000 lives. Walter's hand flew to his chest, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Another was 18-year-old Le Minh Tan, who became a teacher and eventually a university professor. Professor Tan has educated more than 10,000 students over his career, many of whom have gone on to become doctors, engineers, and teachers themselves. The third survivor, Pham Hong Son, entered government service and has spent 30 years working on humanitarian projects, including programs that provide clean water to rural communities. Colonel Harrison paused to let this information sink in before continuing. But here's the most extraordinary part of the story. Dr. Duc, Professor Tan, and Minister Pham have spent decades trying to find the American soldiers who saved their lives. They established a foundation in Vietnam dedicated to promoting peace and reconciliation between former enemies. When the Vietnamese government finally declassified their own records about that engagement, they reached out to the Pentagon to help locate you. Sarah felt goosebumps rise on her arms as she began to understand the incredible scope of this story. A single act of compassion in a Vietnamese jungle had created ripples that had spread across decades and continents. Captain Rodriguez pulled out his phone and showed Walter a photograph. "This picture was taken 3 weeks ago in Ho Chi Minh City," he said. "Dr. Duc, Professor Tan, and Minister Pham are holding a banner with your names on it, yours, my father's, O'Brien's, and Chen's. They wanted you to know that they remember and that they've never stopped being grateful." Walter studied the photograph through his tears, seeing 3 elderly Vietnamese men smiling at the camera, holding a sign written in both Vietnamese and English. "Thank you, Sergeants Kowalski, Rodriguez, O'Brien, and Chen. You taught us that enemies can become brothers." "They wanted to come here in person," Major O'Brien added, "but their age and health made the journey impossible. Instead, they asked us to deliver this." Colonel Chen handed Walter a beautifully carved wooden box. Inside, nestled in silk, was a small jade Buddha surrounded by letters written in careful English on rice paper. Walter opened the first letter with trembling hands and began to read aloud. "Dear Sergeant Kowalski, you do not know me, but you saved my life on March 23, 1969. I was 16 years old and dying from shrapnel wounds when you gave me water from your own canteen and bandaged my wounds with supplies from your own kit. I have lived 72 years since that day, and every morning when I wake up, I think of your kindness. I became a doctor because of what you showed me about healing. I wanted you to know that your compassion saved not just my life, but all the lives I have been able to save because you kept me alive that day." The letter was signed Dr. Nguyen Van Duc and included a photograph of a large hospital with his name on a plaque by the entrance. Sarah watched Walter read letter after letter, each one a testament to how a single moment of human decency had cascaded through time, creating waves of healing and hope that had touched thousands of lives. She thought about all the mornings she had served him coffee and listened to his stories, never knowing that she was caring for someone whose actions had changed the world in ways that were only now being revealed. "There's one more thing," Colonel Harrison said softly. "The 3 Vietnamese men wanted us to ask you a question. They want to know if you would accept an invitation to visit Vietnam as guests of their government. They want to show you the hospital Dr. Duc built, the schools where Professor Tan taught, and the villages where Minister Pham brought clean water. They want to introduce you to some of the thousands of people whose lives were touched by your act of mercy 56 years ago." Walter looked overwhelmed by the magnitude of the offer. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for such a journey," he said quietly. "I'm 94 years old and I'm not as steady as I used to be." Sarah found herself speaking before she had fully formed the thought. "You wouldn't have to go alone," she said. "I mean, if you wanted someone to go with you to help take care of you during the trip." Everyone at the table turned to look at her, and Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude on this moment. Walter has become like family to me, and I want to make sure he's okay." Colonel Harrison smiled warmly. "Miss, I think you've already proven that you understand what true service looks like. The Vietnamese government specifically requested that we extend the invitation to include any family members or caregivers who are important to Sergeant Kowalski. Walter reached over and took Sarah's hand in both of his. Sarah, you've already given me more than I ever could have asked for. You don't need to. I want to, Sarah interrupted. Walter, you've spent months telling me stories about your life, about Margaret, about the war. This is the chance for you to see the rest of your story, the part you never knew existed. I can't think of anything more important than being there with you when you meet the people whose lives you saved. The Marines exchanged glances, and Colonel Harrison nodded approvingly. The trip would be fully funded by the Vietnamese-American Reconciliation Foundation. You would stay in the finest accommodations, have medical support available at all times, and be treated as honored guests of the state. Walter was quiet for a long moment, staring at the jade Buddha in his hands. Finally, he looked up at Sarah with those storm-gray eyes that had first drawn her to him. Would you really come with me, an old soldier on one last mission? Try and stop me, Sarah replied, squeezing his hand. The news of Walter's story spread through Cedar Falls like wildfire. Within hours, the local newspaper was running a front-page story about the forgotten hero who had been living quietly among them. By evening, the national news had picked up the story, and by the end of the week, Walter Kowalski had become a symbol of the kind of quiet heroism that often goes unrecognized. The diner became a pilgrimage site for veterans and their families, people who came to meet the man who had shown that even in war, compassion could triumph over hatred. Walter handled the attention with characteristic modesty, always deflecting praise toward his fallen comrades and insisting that he had simply done what anyone would have done. 2 months later, Sarah found herself boarding a plane to Vietnam alongside Walter, Colonel Harrison, and the 3 sons of his wartime brothers. Walter was nervous about flying and about returning to a place that held so many difficult memories, but his excitement about meeting the men whose lives he had saved was palpable. The welcome they received in Ho Chi Minh City was unlike anything Sarah could have imagined. Hundreds of people lined the streets as their motorcade passed, holding signs in Vietnamese and English expressing gratitude and welcome. At the airport, Dr. Duck, Professor Tan, and Minister Pham were waiting with their own families, children and grandchildren who existed because Walter and his friends had shown mercy in a moment when mercy seemed impossible. The reunion between Walter and the 3 Vietnamese men was emotional beyond words. These elderly men who had once been enemies embraced like the oldest of friends, tears streaming down their faces as they thanked each other for the gift of life and the chance to meet again in peace. Over the following week, Sarah watched Walter visit the hospital where Dr. Duck had saved thousands of lives, the university where Professor Tan had educated generations of students, and the rural villages where Minister Pham had brought clean water and hope. At each location, people lined up to meet the American soldier whose single act of compassion had rippled through their community in ways large and small. But perhaps the most moving moment came when they visited a small elementary school in a village outside Ho Chi Minh City. The children had prepared a program of songs and dances to honor Walter, and their teacher explained that the school had been built with funds from Dr. Duck's foundation, money he had earned as a surgeon, a career that existed only because Walter had saved his life 56 years earlier. As Sarah watched 94-year-old Walter sitting on the floor with dozens of Vietnamese children climbing over him and laughing, she understood something profound about the nature of heroism. True heroes aren't the people who seek recognition or glory. They are the people who choose compassion over hatred, mercy over vengeance, and love over fear, even when no one is watching, and even when history might forget their names. The journey to Vietnam transformed Walter in ways that Sarah could never have expected. The man who had been quietly carrying guilt and trauma for more than half a century seemed to shed years of burden as he witnessed the incredible good that had grown from a single moment of humanity in the midst of inhumanity. When they returned to Cedar Falls, Walter was different. The tremor in his hands had lessened, his appetite had improved, and most importantly, the distant sadness that had always lingered in his eyes had been replaced by a sense of completion and peace. He continued to come to Mel's diner for his regular breakfast, but now he was often joined by other veterans who had heard his story and wanted to share their own experiences. Sarah returned to her job as a waitress, but she too was changed by what she had witnessed. She had seen firsthand how a single act of kindness could create ripples that spread across oceans and through generations. She began paying closer attention to the stories of all her customers, wondering what hidden heroism might be sitting quietly in the corner booth, waiting to be recognized and honored. 6 months after their return from Vietnam, Walter passed away peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by the medals and honors he had finally received, and the photographs of the lives he had touched. At his funeral, Sarah was surprised to see representatives from the Vietnamese embassy, along with dozens of local veterans who had been inspired by his story to share their own experiences of service and sacrifice. But the story didn't end with Walter's death. The Vietnamese-American Reconciliation Foundation established a scholarship in his name, funding educational opportunities for young people in both countries who demonstrated commitment to peace and humanitarian service. Dr. Duck, Professor Tan, and Minister Pham continued to correspond with Sarah, sharing updates about the ongoing work of healing and reconciliation that Walter's actions had set in motion. Sarah kept the corner booth at Mel's Diner as a kind of memorial to Walter. A small plaque by the window read, "In memory of Sergeant Walter Kowalski and all those who choose compassion over hatred." But more importantly, she carried forward the lesson that Walter had taught her about the power of simple human kindness. Years later, when people asked Sarah about the most important thing she had learned from her friendship with Walter, her answer was always the same. Heroes aren't born, they're made in moments of choice. And those moments happen every day in ordinary places to ordinary people who decide that love is stronger than fear. Walter showed me that the most powerful force in the world isn't weapons or politics or money. It's one person caring about another person, especially when that person is supposed to be their enemy. The story of Walter Kowalski and the waitress who cared for him became a reminder that in a world often defined by division and conflict, individual acts of compassion can create bridges that span any distance, heal any wound, and transform any enemy into a brother. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get to witness the moment when those bridges are finally revealed, when the hidden connections that bind us all together become visible, and when love proves itself to be the most enduring force of all. In the end, Walter's story was not really about war or politics or even heroism in the traditional sense. It was about the simple truth that every person we meet carries within them an infinite capacity for both goodness and greatness, and that our job as human beings is to see that capacity, nurture it, and help it shine. Sarah had thought she was just serving coffee to a lonely old man. Instead, she had been caring for a hero whose greatest victory was not any battle he had won, but the moment he had chosen to see his enemies as human beings deserving of mercy, compassion, and care.